even just writing things on Twitter for myself, I'm thinking of, current events that are happening in the Marianne Williamson campaign, or certain accomplishments, or things that I'm defending against, or whatever. When I'm writing it, even because it's such a short form, I think of it almost as like a short form little prose or a poem. Just what's the
That's
most
great. Oh, that's really great.
impactful way that you
Yeah.
can help someone to understand, how to think, or how to feel, or how to understand what's happening.
Do you ever read poetry?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I treat poetry and music when I'm doing my work in the same way. If the
Hmm.
poetry is by a poet of the time that I'm working on that speaks to my politics and my aspirations, and for example, Walt Whitman is a great example of a figure whose poetry I made it a point of including in my mind as much as I could when I was working on my Thomas Paine book. And then with FDR stuff, it was Langston Hughes, the black poet, and Archibald MacLeish, poets of the 1930s who were politically engaged, but also wanted to communicate and articulate historical aspirations in poetic form. Another great one is Carl Sandburg. People should read Sandburg as well.
I heard his
Fantastic.
book, well, yes, is pretty good.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, again, I had to read, I really had to struggle in reading it because I don't generally read poetry, only at certain moments. And I realized, wow, this guy's kind of articulate, not unlike Walt Whitman, what it means to be an American, I think.
Poets are really interesting because I feel like it's one of those archetypes that's not as prominent. Like I don't think I've met a poet, but you can still have a minor poet sort of bit to your personality, but you don't meet poets very often.
Don't
I,
let a poet hear that, by the way. Don't
okay.
let a poet hear that. But it's interesting to think about this. In Plato's Republic, in Plato's Republic, the speakers warn about the dangers, how dangerous poets are. Because in ancient Greece, the poets were also the historians. They were the memory of events was basically recorded by way of poetic verse, as what I've been told. So really, when they warned about poets, they were also warning about historians. That is, these folks will remember things and tell others of what they remember, which goes back to the very opening question that one of you asked, I think.
Speaking of American authors and historians, I know that you are an esteemed scholar about Thomas Paine,
My
including
hero ever
his.
since I was a child.
Did you read Common Sense when you were a child? When did you first read Common Sense?
Okay, well, what happened was my grandfather and grandmother who lived in Brooklyn, New York, they lived across the street from the Brooklyn Museum. And I used to love to go to the museum because they had an unwrapped mummy at this museum, which every 10-year-old boy
Uh-huh.
couldn't help but be, sort of drawn to wanting to see it. And when I couldn't go to the museum, I would wander my grandparents' apartment as if it was a museum. And my grandfather was a trial lawyer. And in the dining room on the back wall, he kept his personal books. All his law books were in his office, were separate from the apartment at home. And I sat down in front of the books one day, because most of the books I couldn't make sense of. But there was a book with a red cover that I pulled out, and it said, "The real Thomas Paine, the real author of the Declaration of Independence." So here was a book that was making an argument that showed my teachers were all wrong. And every 10-year-old boy who's a bit rebellious might have wanted to prove their teachers wrong.
Hmm.
So when I was very young, immediately this guy, Thomas Paine, captured my imagination. And so while I was in middle school and then high school, yeah, I started reading Thomas Paine's stuff. My grandfather gave me some of his works. Um, so I read Common Sense pretty early on. Common Sense, I tried to read some of the other things that were a bit more demanding because I didn't know anything about the
Hmm.
French Revolution and so on. But I always thought of Paine as my first childhood hero, aside from a baseball or football figure. Yeah.
I haven't personally read Common Sense, but would you say it's pretty easy to digest? Like, the
What I would
language
say
is
is that
simple?
everyone should keep it by. Here's what there was the great feminist from the early part of the 19th century, who told other young women, you must keep common sense bedside. In other words, it will remind you what it means to be an American. It's
Hmm.
like, and I would tell you that some of the language is a bit, it's written in the 18th century, written in 1775, published in 76. But it's like a letter from an old friend.
Mm.
There will be sections that you won't quite get because, say, you're not familiar with the England that he left behind when he came to America. But there are sections which should speak to you pretty strongly. What I would tell you, and you can get it out of the library, I'm not telling you to buy, is buy my book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. Buy this book. And that'll guide you into Thomas Paine very effectively. And
I
then
must
you,
be sure to read that before Common Sense, just so you have some context if you don't know who
yeah,
Thomas.
right. That's a good idea. Very good idea. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Declaration of Independence. If I were to ask if you go back to any point in history, would it be the sign to witness the signing of the Declaration of Independence?
Well, apparently, that's funny to say because, in fact, there's a famous painting of the signing, but it never happened like that. Apparently, it was signed over a matter of days. People would show up, sign it, and go home. That kind of thing. But I think, I mean, people have said to me, well, that kind of question. If you're a historian, is there any time you'd like to go back to? Let me just say, I don't want to live in the past.
Sure.
I want to live in the past. And people say, well, there's no period of history you'd like. I said, no, because I prefer my dentist today than anything they could offer back then. Okay. But more seriously, I don't think I'd want to be there, frankly, because to hear the debate on the Declaration and to hear the argument against attacking the institution of slavery. I mean, they did not. It's a radical document. It could have been made even more radical, perhaps. It would have been frustrating to be there, perhaps. But But having said that, it is, to my mind, one of the truly great documents. People say, "What? It was written by a slaveholder." Yeah, it doesn't. In some ways, it doesn't matter. That just makes the question interesting of how could it be that a man who owned slaves, as he did, write words that are so truly radical and egalitarian? Okay, that's, of course, the question. But Frederick Douglass, the great 19th century Black abolitionist and orator who was born a slave and then freed himself by escaping and went on to become truly one of the great orators of the century. Well, he gave a sermon or lecture at a church up in New England titled, I was on July 5th, the day after July 4th, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And
Oh, wow.
and so much of the sermon, speech, or lecture is really sort of an attack on how can it be that the founders could allow for this kind of America, an America that places in slavery and oppresses and exploits African Americans. But at the very end, he says he still hasn't given up hope that this country can transcend that tragedy, because the promise that's declared and proclaimed in the founding documents, especially perhaps the Declaration, are so powerful that it will, if you like, drive the changes. Now, this is the interesting thing about it, is that he didn't always feel that way. Originally, he was part of the abolitionist movement alongside of Garrison. And Garrison argued that the North should secede from the Union, so it shouldn't be, tarnished by the slavery of the Southern states. And Douglass kind of agreed with that for those years. But then all of a sudden, he switches. And the argument that I read about how that happened is there was an American Northern politician who taught him to read the founding documents in a new way. He said, don't read them in terms of those who wrote them. Read them as having been issued as the foundation of the country. And it's the words and the texts that matter more than the author. So and that enabled him to see the power of the promise of all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. So as a consequence, I've tried to do that as much as I can myself. But I do have to say that still, Thomas Paine's a different story. He opposed slavery, never owned slaves. He actually was a working class guy who was a genius in awakening people to who they were and what they could accomplish. Because until Common Sense appeared, his pamphlet, nobody in this country was talking about the idea of independence and democracy. It just wasn't part of the general public debate.
I was listening to this person, Carolyn Mace. She's one of Marianne's friends. They're spiritual authors. But
I've heard that name, and I'm pretty sure maybe we follow each other on Twitter now. I don't know.
I want you guys to do a conversation together. But Carolyn was saying, because she is somewhat of a historian, she was saying if she would always think she would go back to see the pyramids or something being built or Stonehenge.
Yeah.
But then she said, I hit a point where I realized no, because I think that we're living in the most interesting moment in history now. So she would go forward in history 100 years and read what the historians were writing about us now. And I thought that was really interesting.
You know, that is interesting. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons it's because I always say to people, it's too easy to attack figures of the past so we create heroes. Progressives have heroes. But what we've seen for too many years now is that we tear down the heroes because we find how flawed they were, or the kinds of political sins and moral sins they committed. And I say, you know, I hope in the future folks are able to recognize that we transcended the worst of our days, which right now doesn't seem likely, but it's still not impossible. Okay, in other words, I'd like to imagine that we create a different America sooner rather than later, and thus people later will not see us as what's wrong with those people. Which is also to say we've got to avoid historical chauvinism, like we're better than all our predecessors.
Right.
Similarly, we should be lucky. We'll be lucky if our descendants don't find that we were the worst people on earth.
That's really profound. I've never really thought about it in that context before.
Yeah. Dark. And right now, by the way, the last 50 years, like what they're going to say about us is going to be crap. No, don't get me wrong. There have been real advances in terms of LGBTQ rights, in terms of, well, it seemed like real advances for women, but of course, you know, we're on the verge of, we've already begun this sort of slide.
But you helped Marianne write the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights, right? The 10-point.
I don't think, I mean, that her Economic Bill of Rights, Alan Minsky and I composed a year or two ago. She had full license to use those.
So I just envision if she becomes president and she would sign that bill, and then you guys would be signing it, and that would be such a monumental moment in history.
I don't see that happening. What I would like to see happening is that she or someone like her gets into the White House with a solid Democratic majority, and they begin to pass laws that literally make that Economic Bill of Rights real. Or I would like, hell, I'd be happy right now if the Democratic Party, because of Marianne's campaign, takes on the Economic Bill of Rights as their agenda. That would be, that alone would give me, I mean, Jesus, I'd be.
It'd take a minute to give her credit, but.
It's FDR who would deserve the credit anyhow. I mean, he was the one who proposed that, the idea that Americans must create an Economic Bill of Rights. And the rest of us are just smart enough to recognize the value of his vision.
Currently, I feel as though people are so disillusioned with the current state of the Democratic Party, particularly younger people who are aware of a lot of these things that you've said, including the takeover of the corporatocracy, the neoliberalism throughout every bit of the legislature.
I do.
Could you envision us winning a majority with which to pass anything progressive if people are so dissatisfied with Democrats because of their perceived neoliberalism?
Now it's hard to envision that. Right now, it's hard to envision that. The polling is such. But see, let's suppose for a moment Marianne had never entered the race. Okay? Just for a moment. Because people always say, well, she's not helping the Democrats win. Well, bullshit. Okay, bullshit. The problem is the Democrats, I call the Bidenettes, as I call them. Okay, the Bidenettes refuse to recognize what they must look. Even if they failed on the first go around, Biden and his crew should recognize that the only way you're going to take back America is by advancing a really progressive, if not indeed radical agenda that you're willing to commit yourself to. I mean, look, 2020, Bernie would have beaten Trump. Maybe would have actually beaten him by more than Biden beat him. Okay. And I don't know if you guys remember when Biden won. Well, he got the support of Obama and Clyburn in South Carolina, which enabled him to secure the nomination. He was a loser up until that point. They were all losers. The only one who was really winning in a significant way was Bernie. And then they blocked it by all rallying around Biden. And then Biden tried to extend an olive branch by saying, well, we'll create commissions to put together the platform.
Right.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that there were really important, there were significant people on the economic policy platform who contacted me to try to advance the Economic Bill of Rights as part of the Democratic platform or something like it. And the folks in the Biden camp wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. And then he added fuel to the fire, so to speak, by saying he would veto Medicare for all. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, that's an expression of Biden's full career as a politician, because in the Senate, he was constantly trying to cut into Social Security and Medicare, that kind of stuff. He said, we've got to limit it, we've got to constrain it.
For all, he just flat out said I would not sign it if it was on my desk.
Yeah, if it was on my desk, right, I would be right. He just wouldn't sign it, right?
Yeah.
So the fact is that they should wake up. The majority of American people want the kinds of things an Economic Bill of Rights would assure them. They want it. And Marianne realizes that, though she's not getting the hearing that she deserves. Well, if Biden wants to turn the tide, I don't know what's going on with Biden and his cohort, because they're not doing anything to turn the tide. They think they're going to win again because they're not Trump.
Right.
So I get to the point I don't even know what to say about what they're doing. I mean, I'll be voting Democratic in the fall, but it doesn't mean I'll be happy. As I always tell students, would say, well, how do you choose a candidate? And I said, well, I vote defensively I vote defensively. Other than when Bernie was running in the primaries here in Wisconsin, I voted defensively, basically.
Is there a thing to which you'd vote for the Democrat? Let's say if it was Joe Biden and then it was Kamala Harris and then it was Pete Buttigieg and then is it just, if that's how it ends up being? Someone made this map that was terrifying, and AOC was like in 2050 or something.
I'm not confident AOC would ever be able to win the presidency. Let me make that clear, okay? Well, given what I've seen, but Bernie showed that a progressive left candidate, a social democrat, he preferred the term democratic socialist, offered possibilities. He was the most popular figure. Not right now, but for several years, he was the most popular political figure in America. And the Democrats blocked him. And that's what they did. They blocked him. Okay. I mean, so do I fear the possibility it would go Biden, Harris, Buttigieg? Well, yeah, but not as much as I do the idea that it would be Trump Jr. and Trump Jr. Okay.
They'd throw Ivanka in there to have a female. the first female president, Ivanka Trump.
There you go.
There you go.
Now I'm gonna have a nightmare tonight.
Sorry, my bad.
You're bad, right?
If you could ask FDR one piece of advice right now, what might it be?
That's a nice question, but I actually don't need to. I really think that I figured it out with him. So more likely, if I could tell FDR, if there really, there was, if anything, I'd say to him.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to spin it. Absolutely.
I think I would have said, I sure as hell wish you would have been more aggressive on civil rights. I don't know how people underestimate the ways in which even in the New Deal, civil rights were almost built in. I mean, undeniably, the Democrats at that time were, they used to call it, there was two tracks. You could take the track of emphasizing, say, the need to address racial injustices, or you could pursue the track that they pursued, which I think was actually the smart track at the time, and that was universal policies. The problem was that they had to constantly compromise with Southern Democrats. So if they passed a really good law to create a really important progressive social democratic program, they had to basically say, well, and this will be handled at the state level, which enabled the Southern white supremacists, the racists, to use even laws that were not intended to be discriminatory, to discriminate. But even with that, more African Americans benefited from the New Deal policies in the 30s than had ever benefited since literally the liberation of slaves, of slaves in 1865. I mean, it really was the beginnings, not to mention that during World War II, there were policies initiated that literally raised African American incomes, African American women incomes in particular, significantly. So it was there. Plus, he named a Supreme Court in the late 30s that eventually, it was called the Roosevelt Court, that eventually led the way to the court that was known as the Warren Court. I mean, it's beginning there. That doesn't let him off the hook, but he did bring more African Americans into the administration than ever before. I mean, there are those kinds of policies, but that would take me a whole lecture in itself to go through.
Yes. Okay.
I'm not excusing him. All I'm saying is that we shouldn't immediately assume everyone. I suffer it all the time on Twitter. Oh, he was a racist. The New Deal was racist. If the Democratic progressives and FDR and Eleanor had been able to do what they wanted to do, it would not have been that way. They had to make compromises, tragic compromises. Yeah. There's a good writer on this, two African-American historians I've got to recommend. One is Adolph Reed, and the other is Torrey, his son, two generations, both of whom have far, I mean, I could explain a lot, but if people want a person of color to vouch for what I'm saying, go to these guys. They're really outstanding historians.
If you could talk to three people from history that you would want to talk to now, not to advise, would Thomas Paine make that list, or do you feel like there's not much?
Thomas Paine would be one. That would be the first one I would want to speak. Yeah, because there are things that in his experience that I want to know more about, and it would be great to know so I know his life story. So, and I also know in his writings, there are places where I think, I wonder if he wrote that particular line because of this particular experience. And as a historian, that intrigues me. I think Abraham Lincoln would be fascinating to meet. Absolutely. I think would be fascinating. I think FDR would be fascinating. I also think Mother Jones, the great labor leader, Emma Goldman, the anarchist, Walt Whitman would be a blast, I think. Absolutely a blast. I bet I'm leaving out somebody really important that I'd like to.
Carl Sandburg.
Carl Sandburg, there you go. Well, actually, I'd like to get that whole crew of poets together. They might have, I'm sure they knew each other in their own way during the 30s. I'd like to bring them together to ask them, well, let me change that. Let me play off of that. I wish we could come up with that. I wish we could make more of some really great poets. There must be great poets out there who we're not becoming aware of because they're not getting the hearing that McLeish and Hughes and Sandburg got. And we've lost touch with so much of American sort of culture.
Right.
I mean, if you're going to complain about corporate power, complain about the NFL, complain about, I love the Green Bay Packers, but I hate the NFL and what they've done to professional football, and basically corporate interests are turning college football. It's already corporatized, but it's turning that into a disaster. The way things are going, to my mind. And I'm a big LSU fan because I did my PhD at LSU. But I think if you think about the ways in which corporate pursuit of profit is literally suppressing really good, possibly intellectual and cultural developments, I mean, that's just outrageous, absolutely outrageous. It'd be great to have to have more theater in America, to have
Hmm.
in London for a while, they were putting a poet on every subway train, every underground train, just as an experiment, give people a chance to enjoy poetry. But of course, I don't want just silly poetry. I want engaged poetry. I want poetry and theater that'll make people think and maybe excite them to become more engaged in a progressive way. I mean, that's my politics.
Oh, I grew up on silly poetry. We had Shel Silverstein and
Oh, hey,
Dr.
that, by the
Seuss
way,
and
absolutely. God forbid we should ever not have silly poetry. I just want, yeah, you're right. Shame on me for saying that.
I think Shel Silverstein got canceled for something. I think
I don't
he's
know much
canceled.
about it.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
well, that's the other thing. We've got to have a different historical sensibility, perhaps.
Right.
And I don't want to know what that was right now. Okay, what cancel him, so to speak.
Oh yeah, I don't know either. And
Poet Anne would choose for her inauguration. You know how they choose a poet?
Oh yeah,
I don't know who it would be. I'm sure she does. But
well, that'd be good. That's a good question. You know what? I'm going to have to remember to ask her that. I'm going to ask her that.
you'll get to her before I do, so go for it.
Yeah, no. In fact, I always look for there are times where campaigning for the presidency is draining,
Yeah.
really draining, and I know how exhausted she gets. But it would be fun to instead of just to talk to her about the goddamn media kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
It'd be good to say to her, who'd you like to have as the poet at something like that? That'd be great.
That I've talked to Marianne, I know Christian has too, multiple times, and I kind of regret the questions I asked her because there was one time, the last time I talked to her, she had a jacket on and I got her so stressed out. She took her jacket off and she's like, and I'm like, oh, great. I just stressed her out because it was.
By the way, you didn't do anything wrong. If she's seeking the presidency,
That's
being
true.
stressed out should be a regular experience.
That's true. Fair enough.
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, but that's a good question. That's a good question to ask anybody. If you were president of the United States, who would you want to read a poem at? That's good. To compose a poem for your inauguration. That's really good. Yep.
Awesome. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor
No, pleasure.
Harvey J.
Since
Kaye.
I know you both separately, I was glad that. Have you ever met the two of you?
Yeah.
I'm not in person, but
no,
yeah.
I meant in person. Yeah, I meant in person. Okay.
No, when I was living in Wisconsin, I maybe could have trekked out to Minnesota, but didn't make it.
Well, you could have trekked up here if you'd wanted.
To Green Bay, yeah. No, that would be even easier.
That would have been like a 2-hour trek. That's not so much.
Yes. Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been such an honor. I'm really grateful to have spoken to you.
I'm honored that you guys asked me. I'm honored that the questions asked. I mean, some of them, I know I flipped them in some cases, but and by the way, that's a good trick to learn if you're ever asked a question. Learn how to flip it.
Flip the question.
It is a good thing to do. It's like sometimes I'd say to my students, in the Jewish culture that I grew up in, there was still an element from the long days past, and that was if there was a classroom situation or any kind of intellectual situation, if you're challenged with a question, the best thing to do is not to answer the question to show you know the answer. The thing is to respond with a question that says, I could have answered that question, but let's take the discussion further along. Okay. It's called, there's a Socratic method in teaching, which is question and answer, question and answer. Then there's a Talmudic, Talmudic, Talmudic system, which says question, question, question. It's dialectical in a sort of Marxian or Hegelian sense. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you very much. This was so much fun.